Believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. Hello, everyone, and welcome to None of What You Hear, a new podcast that tells the stories of the darker side of pop culture. I'm Robin, and every 2 weeks I will bring you the legends and lore that have turned fame into infamy and celebrity into conspiracy. Today we will begin one of the most tragic, tumultuous, and heartbreaking stories I've ever read personally, and certainly the darker side of Hollywood has to offer from deep within its vaults of encrypted records. From the outset, I do want to let you know I'm going to be wrestling with some pretty difficult topics today. I won't be getting into graphic or salacious details, but I do feel it's worth mentioning that this particular story can't be told completely or done proper justice without some reference to severe mental health issues, attempted suicide, drug and alcohol abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and a very brief mention of child sexual abuse. I know everyone has their own journeys and baggage attached to those subjects, so I just want to put it out there in case anyone's feeling particularly tender at the moment. Because potential triggers aside, this story is spectacularly loaded. Movie stars and mafia kingpins, Nazis, playwrights, presidents, pinkos, and legendary sportsmen, famous crooners, and outright commies. All from the eyes of an orphan waif who became the most iconic cinematic shooting star those of us landlocked on this third rock may have ever gazed upon. Shortly after Agent Dale Cooper arrives in Twin Peaks to investigate the murder of Laura Palmer, he muses, "Diane, there are two things that continue to trouble me. I'm speaking now not just as an agent of the Bureau, but as a human being. What really went on between Marilyn Monroe and the Kennedys, and who really pulled the trigger on JFK? Well, Special Agent Dale Cooper, this one's for you. And even though I'm under my own strict advisement not to go anywhere near the Kennedy assassination in my freshman year, while I was in search of information on the former, I may have just stumbled on a possible answer to the latter. And while I'll be primarily focused on the mesmerizing and agonizing life and times of the woman born Norma Jean Baker Mortensen and who died Marilyn Monroe, the sordid stories behind the gates of Camelot are intertwined closely enough to hopefully at least satisfy some of Agent Cooper's curiosity. But this isn't a story about clear answers. And it's not about virtuous heroes and knights pure of heart and valor like Agent Cooper. It's a heavy burden about looking for love in all the wrong places, and discovering, surprising, and then just as soon losing yourself in the process. So without any more of the tardiness, delay, and anticipation she herself added to the list of the many things she was famous for, I bring you the unsettling and unparalleled tale of foiled hope and woe that is the life of Marilyn Monroe. A newlywed couple finally begins to settle into their East Midtown Manhattan apartment, exchanging satisfied gazes between each other and the Queensboro Bridge. He's a celebrated playwright, and she has just founded her own film production company. A pioneering example of a New York City power couple long before women were brazen enough to presume they belonged in executive roles, much less before terms like power couple were bandied about as commonplace. It had been a long, precarious journey, and not just up the 12 flights of stairs for the baby grand piano she whimsically plucks out a tune on with one hand, while gently stroking her growing baby bump with the other. He sits in the corner puffing on his pipe and reading a book in a plush leather chair near the window. It's a fleeting and precarious picture of peace, contentment, and achievement that would be a touchstone of possibly the safest and most secure Marilyn Monroe would ever feel in her short and turbulent life. Norma Jean Baker Mortensen was born into well-established turmoil on June 1st, 1926. Her father was already well absent by the time a divorced Gladys Monroe Baker delivered Norma at a neighbor's home across the street from her vacationing mother's house in Hollywood. This is actually one of my first personal surprises in the story. I'd always assumed Norma Jean Baker Mortensen was a name well primed to belong to a poor Midwestern girl who had clumsily stumbled out of a Greyhound with an overstuffed carry-on on the outskirts of Hollywood in search of fame, fortune, and a quick-fire realization of the American dream. Nope. Marilyn Monroe's origin story has her roots right there in the center of the vacuum that for all practical purposes continues to siphon little bits of her soul to this very day. L.A., California. Shortly after Norma Jeane was born, her mother Gladys moved into her own apartment to focus on work in the film development and processing labs of the Consolidated Film Works, who serviced some of the studios that at the time were owned by an East Coast captain of industry by the name of Joseph Kennedy. Remember that name, it'll come up again. The neighbors we spoke about earlier were commissioned about $5 a week, around $80 in today's money, to look after Norma, while her mother kept up the appearance of someone who was not actually a divorcee and who had not in fact just had a child out of wedlock. 2 strikes towards a social death mark in the puritanical and judgmental 1920s, even in Babylonian L.A. Gladys would typically visit weekly, but as Norma reached speaking age, she was often, to her confusion, corrected when referring to the neighborly care providers as Mama and Papa as the other children in the home had. Sometimes Gladys Monroe Baker, a woman Norma hardly knew but was instructed instead to refer to as Mama, would allow Norma to stay for short periods of time at her small apartment. It was there Norma was once shown a photograph of a tall drink of a man she initially mistook for Clark Gable but was informed was actually her true birth father, a man by the name of Stan Gifford, neither Baker nor Mortensen. But please don't get confused by the names. There won't be a quiz and this isn't Game of Thrones. I will, however, do my very best to keep things well explained on my end, as the characters are many in this epic cast. Otherwise, during visits with Gladys, young Norma Jeane typically spent the bulk of her time hiding in the closet, as the sound of even a book page turning would send her mother into a confusing irritation that could often build to rage. There was a well-established history of mental illness long down the Monroe family line. As the Great Depression hits, not even the $5 stipend was enough incentive for Norma Jeane to be able to continue her makeshift living arrangements, and her mother Gladys finally agreed to take her on. As Gladys made the almost crazed, complete 180 to the life of a mother, her wishes to make good for the lost time and provide Norma Jeane with a normal life became an untethered obsession. She began to maniacally manifest a lifestyle for her newfound family well outside her means. She made purchases on credit that stretched their already thin shoestring budget to a thread. She bought a baby grand piano and a set of love seats with fantasies that Norma Jeane would serenade small Sunday family gatherings, though the piano and furniture alone represented months of wages worth of food and lodging on her income on top of the barely covered mortgage, even working double shifts at the film processing labs. And when she was the last person to realize her financial commitments were completely unsustainable, she took on a British couple involved with the film industry but also struggling to make ends in competitive Hollywood. Shortly after the couple's arrival, a then 8-year-old Norma Jeane was beckoned into the rented room by the man, who proceeded to lock the door behind her and sexually assault the young girl. Norma Jeane's traumatized attempts to alert her care of what had just transpired upstairs fell on the deaf ears of defensive denial initially, but eventually overcome by the financial stresses of sustaining the household and the guilt of downplaying Norma Jeane's molestation, Gladys was finally consumed by the pressures and lack of coping skills to manage them, rendering her institutionalized at the hands of a nervous breakdown. With the Great Depression still at full steam and no one able to offset any kind of additional financial burden, Norma Jeane was placed to her bafflement in an orphanage. Overwhelmed by the sudden abandonment, as well as the confusion, trauma, and misplaced guilt surrounding the incident that incited all the trouble, orphan number 3463 began to develop a stutter, insomnia, and night terrors that would plague her in times of stress, uncertainty, and emotional pain throughout her life. She spends the next few years that would mark the end of the Depression and the beginnings of World War II being shuffled between the orphanage, foster care, and scattered relatives and associates of the fractured family. Generally a quality of life with nowhere to belong or trust for very long, if at all, save the temporary escape the penny cinema and Grauman's Chinese offered her. It was there she found comfort and fantastical friendship from the school bullying and isolation that consumed the long days and unbearable nights of Norma Jeane's dark childhood. A small ray of sunshine breaks the black horizon as Norma Jeane wakes to her last day ever in the orphanage or shuffled around foster home shortly after her 11th birthday. She finds a more permanent home with some distant family friends for an extended period in late spring of 1937. And for about the next 5 years, Normajeane gets to live the life of a normal girl. Though she is still moved around frequently, she is at least allowed to stick with the same group of people, providing some semblance of stability. And as her cocoon of orphan waif begins to shed and a beautiful young woman emerges, she attracts the attention of a neighbor boy and they begin to cultivate an innocent romance. One day he invites her out to the beach, and in a borrowed bathing suit that was too small, she discovers that her body alone seems to be the focus of the buzz of the entire seaside scene. Normajeane, for good reason, is shocked by this, the first pure instance of positive attention from anyone, possibly ever, and reasons surely all this fuss can't be directed at her, but feels deep within her soul it somehow is. She is quoted this way in reminiscence of the developmental event. I was full of a strange feeling as if I were two people. One of them was Normajeane from the orphanage who belonged to nobody. The other was someone whose name I didn't know, but I knew where she belonged. She belonged to the ocean and the sky and the whole world. But the bliss is always brief for Norma, and in 1942, when a career opportunity threatens to uproot the hosting family along with Normajeane to the East Coast, she agrees almost out of nowhere to marry her neighbor crush. He goes by the name of Jim Daughtry and is 5 years senior to Norma's tender 16 years old. It's designed to be a green card marriage of sorts and keeps her from another traumatic upheaval, this time geographical as well as emotional and far away from even the most flimsy of security blankets she'd ever known in LA. Normajeane was very nervous about the expectation of sex, but reassured by Daughtry's mother not to worry, Jim'll teach ya. Gulp. Though Norma's estranged mother Gladys may or may not have been in any kind of mental state to process the news, she was not among the 25 guests in attendance for the occasion, as she had been moved to a psychiatric facility closer to San Francisco. As the war in Europe and Japan ramped up, Jim felt compelled to join the efforts, to the dismay and disappointment of his new bride, who was just getting used to the idea of some kind of stability in her so far turbulent and tumultuous life. And as young Jim Daughtry shipped away from their humble Catalina abode, Normajeane found a job at a nearby aeronautical assembly plant supporting the troops overseas. As a shapely overalled Norma toiled her days away at the plant, and Jim Daughtry served the seas with his crew of merchant marines, another young man packed his Harvard bags and began his first active duty assignment at the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington, D.C. By all military standards, he should not have been declared stable for duty owing to a chronic back condition and a history of unstable health. But when your father yields the almighty hand of power and influence that steel tycoon, film investor, and esteemed wartime ambassador to the UK Joe Kennedy does, anything is not only possible, it's mandated. So young John Fitzgerald Kennedy begins what will become his illustrious and heroic military career. But what we already know walking into this story is that in typical Kennedy fashion, it's not going to be without controversy and intrigue. And as the dumb luck of our tale would bestow upon us, we are not only introduced to key player JFK at this time, but are also unexpectedly treated to our first meeting of preeminent FBI tyrant J. Edgar Hoover, who had his surveillance eye well trained on Jack as early as 1941 when it was suspected he was romantically involved with a probable Nazi spy. A Nordic bombshell of a potential real-life James Bond character by the name of Inga Avrid, or Inga Binga, as surveillance records state she was referred to by Jacko Tobacco. Inga had numerous high-level Third Reich connections, the likes of Rudolf Hess, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels, and had also accompanied none other than Adolf Hitler himself as his date to a box seat viewing of the 1936 Olympic Games. When various repeated efforts made between Hoover and Joe Kennedy to curtail the affair were ignored, Jack was eventually transferred to the South Pacific, far away from the sultry Scandinavian source of scandal, and where he would eventually become a celebrated war hero. Back in LA, the wartime economy was booming, with debts of gratitude being owed to the efforts on the front in the film industry and the assembly line. From Normajeane's station at Radio Plains, she caught the eye of a young military journalist, and quickly became the unnamed face of the female work corps faction of the local troop support. A true blue, flesh and blood, Rosie the Riveter style mascot. That's our Norma, A real assembly line catch, way above her station in beauty. She had to turn down as many dates as photo ops she granted. Normajeane became less and less concerned with the whereabouts and upcoming leave of her absentee beau and focused more and more on the cameras that seemed to relish being focused on her. In the accepting and welcoming kindness the eye of the camera provided, she and her unnamed sole passenger once again were bestowed with the unconditional love and acceptance they had tasted on the salt air of the beach that day with Jim before the hasty wedding. Meanwhile, the tentative timidity for sex she had mustered to overcome in order to perform the required expectations of her all but arranged marriage became practically insatiable, fueled by the attention she was getting from the photographers and modeling industry personnel now hounding her on the daily. However, with Norma even then the highs were high and the lows were low. And blame genetics or her unfathomable child development circumstances, or both, but she was very much prone to bouts of extreme sadness and melancholy. Especially during the holidays, when a longing for family, specifically a nurturing and protective father figure, became particularly dire. During one of these bouts of introspection, she made her first attempt to contact her father Stan Gifford, a decision that proved to be a devastating disappointment and set off a bout of night terrors. One chilling incident recalled by a photographer she was dating involved her waking in a cold sweat and stuttering about being forced into a mental institution. Waking to shouts of "I'm not crazy" over and over, the friend recalls Norma explaining the harrowing nightmare like this from his recollection. "They put me in a bleak room with barred windows and they go out and lock the iron door, leaving me in a straitjacket. I don't belong here. I scream it again and again until I have no more breath." As the war comes to an end and the world begins to catch its own breath from the anxieties of World War II, Normajeane had officially stepped away from her predictably ill-fated first marriage with a quickie divorce from Jim Daughtry that was slightly less unceremonious as the informal 25-person ceremony that set it off. However, now with agency representation, her modeling career begins to explode with all the fervor of the V-2 rockets that were finally being put to rest overseas. Drooling soldiers returning from the homeland were greeted by Normajeane on the pages and covers of girly magazines like Click, Pick, Laugh, and Sir, with almost constant consistency. An amused and curious Howard Hughes, who was convalescing from a test plane accident, spotted Normajeane in the pages of Laugh and suggested to an associate the photogenic young model be found and brought in for a test screen at RKO Pictures, which was consolidated in part from one of Joe Kennedy's film ventures some years before. However, as the news spread of Hughes' interest in Normajeane, the ever-competitive Hollywood studio racket conspired to yoink Normajeane's test from under him and set up one with 20th Century Fox, in as much of a hurry to foil Hughes as it was to catch a nebulous shining starlet. Hughes' efforts had crashed like a faulty test vehicle on the Bonneville Salt Flats, and the Fox screen test was a hit despite concerns of a rush to judgment and worries of breach in studio permissions protocol. There was just one catch for Fox. Something had to be done about the lackluster and commonplace twang of the name Normajeane Daughtry. And that was all that stood between what was to become the personification of sex, glamour, and rare baby boom female empowerment and her first Hollywood contract. So when someone at the studio mused at the name Marilyn, her mother's maiden name slipped right in like a glass slipper, and Marilyn Monroe, to this dusty third rock, was born. The unnamed woman within the girl in the tiny bathing suit at the beach that day had finally been realized, and Normajeane shed her curly plain brown locks in favor of a straightened and toxically processed platinum blonde. Marilyn Monroe. She said it over and over like forgotten verses of an ancient folk ballad. As Marilyn Monroe was finding her way around the Fox studios by day, primarily with low-exposure bit parts that only sometimes included one or two spoken lines, she was also navigating the perilous, uncharted waters of parties and social gatherings hosted by the Hollywood elite by night. But as she was still not used to being the center of attention to men or the object of competitive envy for women, she found it difficult to mingle and often kept to herself at the intimidating Hollywood Hills events. It's during this formative time for Marilyn that she experiences one of her first of many brushes with men well connected to the mafia. One of Fox studio czars by the name of Joe Scheck had deep associations with Chicago mafiosos, namely a man who will consistently pop up in the nastiest places throughout our story called John Handsome Johnny Roselli, who was also a sometime golf buddy of Joe Kennedy's. When Marilyn Monroe isn't rubbing elbows with Hollywood's most noteworthy and notorious, she was passionately studying the craft of acting with a lust to learn and perfect she fostered well into the later stages of her career. Unfortunately, the studio was not quite as passionate about advancing her within their roster, and almost just as quickly as she was signed, Fox Studios effectively dropped Marilyn Monroe when they waived renewal of her contract in 1947. Lacking the necessary rejection coping skills she was assuredly never taught in the first place, but which are paramount for the thick skin, water off a duck's back, and other cliches to live by for a successful career in acting, the perceived finality of failure instantaneously threw Marilyn Monroe into a deep depression and rendered her unable to function for quite some time. She actually pretty much dropped off of any traceable Hollywood radar both at the time and looking back with a historical eye now. Outside of her humble beginnings in the film arena, Marilyn Monroe still had a flourishing and well-booked modeling career that also ran completely dormant after her release from Fox. In fact, her disappearance from the public eye is so historically suspicious that it's been widely rumored, if not immortalized, that she was pregnant and delivered a child during the 7-month gap. Furthermore, that it wasn't just a fluke pregnancy resulting from the chasing the contract renewal blues away with some random muscle-bound and chiseled fellow actor, not really her type anyway, but that the father of the child was none other than a returning war hero on the heels of his first landslide congressional district win back east. Always the ladies' man, Jack Kennedy was finding himself right at home in the arms of any blossoming starlet that would have him. He was also known to spend quite a bit of time in Hollywood chasing young female talent. And as our story would have it, one of the dewy-eyed ingenues was our very own, relatively unknown by later comparison, Miss Marilyn Monroe, who may have fallen victim to the Kennedy charm much, much earlier than we had once imagined. There is some flimsy and circumstantial timeline comparison evidence that could substantiate these shocking claims, but there was never a proper Maury Povich paternity test episode filmed on the matter, so take it with a grain of salt for what it's worth. The world may never know the truth, though the alleged Marilyn Monroe JFK Lovechild has come forward, and you can read all about it on the internets of Google. Also look up Cusack Papers for 201 course materials. Marilyn allegedly convalesces at Johnny Roselli's golf resort, which actually tracks with the Joe Kennedy golf buddy angle. And on her return to Hollywood at the urging of mafia-connected studio mogul Joe Scheck, Marilyn begins to seek a launchpad to get her career back off the ground at Columbia Pictures. While her fatalistic career concerns seemed to be steadily resolving, Columbia ultimately decided not to pick up her option when she denied an invite to the casting couch from the Columbia head honcho at the time, Harry Cohn, or as many of the women of the studio referred to him, White Fang. Easy come, easy go is the fickle face of fame and chauvinist show business. So, with the bad news from the second forward-thinking and innovative studio to pass on Marilyn Monroe, she finally lands a bit part in a Marx Brothers film after a rather lurid and demeaning interview/screen test with the brothers themselves. This sets off a bit of a freelance period in Marilyn's acting career, and she's aided in landing random bit parts by a new romantic interest, Johnny Hyde. He also assists her in getting some minor corrective facial surgery and generally helps with polishing her Hollywood brand. However, Johnny was not in good health, and despite his numerous attempts to get Marilyn to marry him just so she would be heir to his fortune, Marilyn opted to keep the integrity of the relationship intact and politely declined as she deemed the commitment on those terms not to be for the right reasons. When Hyde's health finally did fail, Marilyn fell back into a deep depression cycle for weeks, and this would mark her first major barbiturate overdose. She was discovered in the nick of time and rushed to the hospital by her friend and acting coach, Natasha Lightis. As a final act of support, Hyde had secured a role for her on a movie called As Young as You Feel. On the set, still mortified, Marilyn was on the brink of tears on camera and almost always sobbing off camera. In between these bouts of sorrow, she meets a man who would go on to play a huge role in her life, Arthur Miller, who, though still involved in a rocky marriage, is defenseless against her beauty and Marilyn's melancholy charms. An almost immediate and insatiable infatuation is ignited within the famous Death of a Salesman playwright. And hearing of the indignity of her rejection from Columbia, Miller concocts a hilarious jest to play on the lecherous studio head. Working with film mogul Elia Kazan to set up a meeting with old White Fang himself, he enlists Marilyn to masquerade as secretary, a go-to role-playing disguise she would hence employ for years to come. Cohn was baffled to explain from where he knew the attractive secretary and continued to stare quizzically at her the entire time, almost at the cost of ignoring the purpose and matter of the meeting completely. Though the project in question at the meeting never came to fruition due to Cohn's concerns over Miller being a pinko, which is a derogatory term for a communist sympathizer, because official members of the Communist Party used to carry a red membership card, hence Reds. Therefore, non-carrying sympathizers must be pinks or pinkos, implying that they're mixed up in their patriotic leanings, which, as logic would dictate, leads us to believe the natural tonal visual representation of a true U.S. patriot is, of course, white. Naturally, a color-coded tradition that continues to this day, and hence the origin of the popular McCarthy-era disparagement, pinko. Hopefully another random tidbit that helps you with your next tavern trivia night. Otherwise, just a complete derailing of our cute story about the gag our protagonist was playing on her harasser. At any rate, Miller, Marilyn, and Kazan laughed themselves pink at the thought or mention of the prank for weeks thereafter. And Marilyn Monroe's dismal mood over Johnny Hyde's death gradually improved, in no small part as a result of all the good times she was beginning to share with her wholesome friendship with Miller. In the meantime, Marilyn's cinematic lure did not go unnoticed by the public, and even though she was still getting bit part roles, the fan mail began to roll in like Harry Potter's invitations to Hogwarts. And if that reference is lost on you, please take a moment to reevaluate your life and get things together. We just love you and are here to help you. And once the critics and press fell under Marilyn's on-screen hypnotic spell, Fox had no choice but to interpret the theater screen reflections in their eyes as dollar signs and decided to give her a shot at her first starring role. Center screen meets center field. Fade-in camera-shy baseball legend Joe Dimaggio. As Marilyn Monroe was continuing to get recognition with her starring role in the film Don't Bother to Knock, she was still netting the lowest possible wages for similar on-screen appearances. And the studio heads were the first to say, "Remember, you're not a star," presumably for a number of tactical and strategic reasons. Point being, cash was not rolling in the door, and Marilyn still had to pick up the random gig now and again. In an odd twist of fate, one night she was charged with being the driver for a shy visiting sports star, who was never too fond of Hollywood hype and was only slightly more keen on people in general. Marilyn Monroe and Joe Dimaggio struck up an almost instant friendship when she picked him up from his event, and feeling a rare connection, he asked that she pass the hotel and just continue to drive around for a while. Well, they ended up cruising around LA all night and talking until the sun came up. When Marilyn was down with an appendectomy a short time later, Joe was a frequent visitor and comfort. And though Joe was busy on the East Coast with the New York Yankees, and Marilyn's film career was eventually launched into the stratosphere in Hollywood, they still managed to connect frequently on calls and occasional visits on account of Joe's parents and siblings being back in San Francisco. Always longing for a deeper connection of love for her massive but needy heart, the relationship soon grew romantic. It was noticed almost immediately by more than some that Joe was extremely jealous of the attention Marilyn's particular brand of fame attracted, especially when it came to other men, even in their informal friendship and courtship period, and that possessiveness only escalated. And possibly as an effort to ensnare and acquire the naive Marilyn, whether calculated or subconsciously, Joe Dimaggio convinced Marilyn Monroe to a hasty private wedding in San Francisco in January of '54. And always both career-minded, they celebrated a slightly informal honeymoon in Japan in conjunction with an exhibition game Joe was scheduled to play. Also now a major contender with her starring breakthrough roles in Niagara and The Fitting Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, Marilyn was invited to do a USO performance of some musical numbers on the overseas visit for some troops in Korea. Joe begrudgingly agreed, stating, "Go ahead if you want to, it's your honeymoon, not mine." Joe was enraged at the thought of his new bride being ogled by masses of males in uniforms, and that green-eyed monster was about to bite physically. Beginning as early as their honeymoon, Joe Dimaggio started to rough up Marilyn Monroe when she did her actual job of successfully attracting attention from a public that was just as defenseless against her charms, wit, and beauty as he was, which is why he loved and married her to begin with. And it wasn't all guns and roses back in LA either. Marilyn had even mentioned to a friend a fleeting plan to reel Miller into marriage out of nowhere, shortly after the return from overseas, and still very much in newlywed mode, if a battered one it be. There's an awkward account of a dinner party with some Hollywood associates, including Peter Lawford of Frank Sinatra's Rat Pack, his wife Pat, sister of JFK, as well as Jackie and Jack Kennedy himself. It's said at this dinner party JFK was leering at Marilyn Monroe so much that Joe actually grabbed her by the arm and practically dragged her away enraged. Though Jack and Jackie had been married since 1952, there were supposedly many sightings of JFK and Marilyn together in the years between the Kennedy wedding and the time that Joe Dimaggio and Marilyn tied the knot. According to a man named Arthur James, who was a prominent Malibu real estate agent in the mid to late 50s, many locals were aware of an ongoing affair between Jack and Marilyn around that time. As JFK was still primarily an East Coast politician, the trysts were still conducted with a certain level of anonymity. Sightings of a rising starlet on the arm of a primarily unknown, dapper, executive-looking gentleman at the Malibu Cottage Dive Bar, the Holiday House Luxury Micro Hotel, and the Malibu Pier were no big 1950s Malibu whoop. What is a bit of an oddball story occurs several months after the embarrassing Hollywood dinner party. Supposedly, while JFK was in the hospital recovering from back surgery, several visitors couldn't help noticing a poster of Marilyn Monroe in blue shorts on the beach, with her legs open wide, that was hung on the wall upside down. Because a squeaky clean Catholic family-minded politician couldn't possibly convalesce any other way. Meanwhile, Marilyn was preparing to film not only what would end up being one of her trademarks, but perhaps one of the most iconic Hollywood moments of all time. The legendary 7-year itch subway grate scene. As Marilyn Monroe's glamorous white dress was blown upward, revealing her shapely thighs and causing hoots and hollers from all who gazed upon the spectacle, one whiskey-fortified spectator was not so amused. Neighbors to Marilyn Monroe and Joe Dimaggio of the St. Regis speak of screams, a scuffle, and a violent argument coming from the room that night, and Marilyn had to have her bruises heavily made up on the set before call next day. Kinda makes you wish you knew all the stories surrounding the most mythical movie moments, doesn't it? Or maybe glad you don't know. News of the imminent divorce was conveyed by a stuttering Marilyn to her press team, and the public announcement was made upon the 7-year itch company returned to Hollywood from New York City. The press conference shows a visibly distraught Marilyn with a clear bruise on the left side of her forehead, scarcely able to speak through her upset bewilderment. And it's a rather disturbing YouTube watch with the whole backstory in mind. Go ahead, I'll wait. Just push pause so you don't miss the next part. See? Told you. Weird, huh? As her reward for the success of 7-year itch, she was granted a $100,000 bonus as well as a star-studded party at a Hollywood hotspot that was attended by the likes of Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall, Jimmy Stewart, Gary Cooper, Doris Day, and the gentleman she'd once compared the only photo she'd ever seen of her own father to, Clark Gable. "Call me Clark," he said. "You made it, girl," Hollywood said, but always at a cost for Marilyn. An adoring public and the film critics' thumbs up is one thing, but to genuinely be accepted by the Hollywood elite is something out of this world. Especially with the journey Marilyn Monroe had braved against all Vegas odds to get there. Say what you will about Marilyn Monroe, but you can never say she was complacent. And her newfound recognition only fueled her desire to grow, to prove to her mentors and heroes that she wasn't just going to settle for the dumb blonde or sexy ingenue typecast. She was one of them now, a true actress, a real star, not just a flash in the pan or passing it girl of the moment. So when she very vocally expressed concern over the very dumb blonde burlesque dancer she was immediately, if not sooner, handed by Fox for her next role, the fickle face of fame once again flipped her the finger. And to remind her who was boss, Fox put her on suspension and yanked her $100K. And with a sweeping flick of the wrist, motioned her on back to her corner. But thanks to some helpful and savvy friends who pointed out that in doing so they were actually in breach of their contract with the new star, to her corner was the last place she had intentions of going. And according to her plans, she was actually going to be the boss. So documents were drawn up for the establishment of Marilyn Monroe Productions, a venture that would provide her complete creative and financial control of her scripts, roles, directors, and efforts. Shortly before the holidays of 1954, Marilyn bid adieu to the town she had just conquered and, donning a clever disguise of reinvention, boarded a plane from her dumb blonde typecast Hollywood corner to New York City. Zelda Zonk, Marilyn's clever disguise/alter ego, clad in dark clothes with a black wig and glasses, steps off a long cross-country flight to reveal a playfully cloaked Marilyn Monroe and bestow the presence of her newfound queenship to a new corner of the country. As it was also the holidays, the friends boarding her for the time being, the Greens, noticed a melancholy distance in Marilyn's personality, as we've discussed as a cycle before. But she was able to step outside herself long enough to treat the Greens to a performance of Frank Sinatra at the Copa, and the club that had been booked out for the show for weeks walked a table to the front of the stage, a la Goodfellas, and Frank Sinatra stopped singing mid-lyric to give her a wink and show the impromptu guests to a great performance of Old Blue Eyes in his prime. Of course, destined to make new friends, there were also plenty of old in the mix, and Joe Dimaggio was more than happy to lend his ex a hand navigating the city, which she tentatively accepted in favor of bygones leading to new chapters of friendship and growth. But she doesn't need any help of his to find her way to local Arthur Miller, who, yes, still married, is now perfectly content to strike up a torrid clandestine affair with Marilyn. And with the perceived pinko Arthur Miller now a prime candidate for a front row seat to the House Un-American Activities Committee show hosted by the illustrious Joseph McCarthy, celebrated MC J. Edgar Hoover is ready to ensure his invitation by putting both he and, well, why not Marilyn under constant surveillance. There's commies everywhere, I tell ya. Not to downplay the very real threat of the Cold War, but I don't think it's a hot take to say that the Red Scare paranoia was a little extreme. And just as J. Edgar Hoover had their hotel rooms bugged, Joe Dimaggio held down the lobby and creepy hallway stakeouts, but his motivation was a little more possessive than detective, to the point he was once ejected from the Waldorf for breaking down Marilyn's door in a blind rage. But her very most favorite old friend of all time was now Senator John Fitzgerald Kennedy, whose father, Old Man Joe Kennedy, kept an apartment also at the Waldorf. I know I must be sounding like a tabloid gossip column right now, but please, take a moment to note, I never even said a word about Marilyn's torrid affair with Marlon Brando around this time. And it's also in the glamorous New York era that Marilyn discovers another steamy pastime, dissolving her barbiturates in champagne. Chef's kiss. Show business scissor-up. So she keeps a few steady hotel residences and an apartment about town, but occasionally still finds downtime to retreat with the Green couple. And unfortunately, the seemingly welcome Greens were not only siphoning green out of her Marilyn Monroe Pictures bank account, they were also keeping her flooded with pills. But in all the busy party and romantic hubbub, Zelda Zonk still managed to find the intellectual side of the city, enjoying art, cuisine, and culture in spades. And by day, in addition to getting her new production company off the ground, Marilyn dove deep into her acting studies by practically setting up camp at the Actors Studio, the celebrated mainstay of all things historically highbrow acting cred. Under the mentorship of Lee Strasberg, who disciples the likes of Paul Newman, James Dean, Dustin Hoffman, and Al Pacino, her acting craft would reach a depth and color Stanislavski himself might even give a stoic nod of subdued approval. And she was more than ready to give her new method acting skills a ride around the horn. The first of President Monroe's production ventures would be a film called Bus Stop, for which she would be returning to LA. Specifically a contracted Fox Studios where the turn of the tide would now see her calling the shots where once not so long ago she had been shot down. When she landed back in LA, Marilyn was in a sophisticated look of a black cocktail dress with matching gloves, and an eager press corps began inquiring about New York City changes and the new Marilyn. To which the boss lady quipped, "Nope, same person, new dress." It's hard to really convey her wit here, but she had the salty sweet snaps of a gourmet bag of caramel corn. As filming began on Bus Stop, the production was not without its bumps in the road, but ended up being one of Marilyn's most noteworthy performances, showcasing her nose-to-the-grindstone actor studio studies. and her abilities to master a character fathoms deeper than the shallow blonde. And once the movie was finally in the can, Marilyn Monroe was on a plane back to New York City. It's no stretch to say 1955 found Marilyn Monroe ascendant to the absolute summit of her social and professional mountain. However, there was still one huge abyss of which she continued to stare into the eternal void. Love. And as we continue our journey, now may be a good time to explore what love may have looked like to Marilyn Monroe. It was surely not something she lacked. She had so much love to give that she let it cascade forth from her without reserve, saturating every interaction no matter how intimate or inconsequential. That was why it was so easy for anyone within more than a few yards away from her to fall and fall hard. But her benevolence was not always, dare I deem to even assume often, bestowed back in kind. Those she entrusted to provide Marilyn with love always seemed to fall short or completely miss the mark. In fact, considering what she was taught about being shown or receiving love throughout her brief time on this earth, it could be argued she never really had an accurate way to survey what the mere shape of love should look like, even if it was handed to her in its most pure form on a platter. And I'll be the first to admit that may be a harsh judgment, and I am not in charge of anyone's definition or experience of love, but that's just my observation from what I know about this story so far. Her ultimate dream may have been to find love with JFK, and she always trusted that she'd know it when she truly saw it. But her reality may have been that the only human person who ever came close to providing Marilyn Monroe with a realistic version of pure and whole love was her old friend and flame, Arthur Miller, who was finally divorced in June of 1956, but still under the watchful eye of J. Edgar Hoover, who had all but hand-delivered his invite to the House Un-American Activities Committee. Marilyn supported him through his stressful series of hearings when he refused to name the names of his comrades in communist-related activities. And though he did make it out relatively light on consequence, especially when compared to others facing a similar ordeal, it was rumored that any leniency that wasn't consequentially granted in the Miller case was a result of recommendations directly from the office of the senator from the great state of Massachusetts. But with Miller's divorce process and the harrowing hearings behind them, as well as a crash conversion to Judaism, Marilyn Monroe would begin her third marriage by tying a trepidatious but hopeful knot with Arthur Miller under the summer White Plains, New York sun in July of 1956. And the couple makes plans to take the Miller and Monroe show transatlantic when we come back. Arthur Miller was very close to not being granted approval to his passport application, thanks in part to JFK's involvement in the outcome of his House Un-American Activities Committee hearings, allegedly. But as filming began for the second Marilyn Monroe Productions joint, The Prince and the Showgirl in London, the behind-the-scenes drama was already well into production by the time action was first called. Laurence Olivier and Marilyn Monroe were butting heads at the outset. Olivier struggling to maintain the facade of his former greatness, and Marilyn Monroe at fighting weight continuing to prove hers. Olivier saw method acting as the latest fad craze in the film world and mocked Marilyn Monroe's in-depth immersion into becoming her character. When Olivier smugly suggested to Marilyn that all you need to do is be sexy, dear, the already shaky foundation of mutual respect was demolished to make room for an all-out grudge match. It's not that Marilyn Monroe was always a shining beacon of progressive feminism, but a strong and beautiful female in Hollywood was a rare beast Olivier took task to tame. And as I've already implied, the filming was a near disaster. All parties were lucky to walk away with a final passable product, and unfortunately Arthur Miller was unable to meet Marilyn Monroe's cryptic cipher of support needs, as she had handily provided him through his hearing woes. But never fear, JFK is always near. And as dumb luck would have it, rat packer Sammy Davis Jr. was living in London at the time, and provided an easy meetup venue for JFK and Marilyn Monroe to unwind from the stresses of ever-growing power and influence within their own respective worlds. And a sad tale is told that when Jackie was suffering pregnancy complications back on the East Coast, Jack was enjoying a lavish French Riviera yacht party with Marilyn Monroe, as Prince and the Showgirl broke from filming for a long weekend. Jackie underwent an emergency C-section, which proved unsuccessful to save the baby, and Jack was finally located between some recorded diplomatic duties and time with Marilyn, and flew home 5 days later. Stand-up guy. But don't wish him too much ill will yet. A Time magazine article later reported that old Joe Kennedy had offered Jackie $1 million not to divorce Jack after the unfathomably hurtful incident. Do we wonder if Joe offered Miller the same to stay with Marilyn and keep her away from Jack? Signs point to no, as Marilyn Monroe returned from the hiatus and found that Arthur Miller's open journal had some not-so-romantic prose expressed about her from the newlywed and quickly betrayed playwright. And Marilyn discovered that even a man of so many lovely words couldn't come up with more colorful terms than bitch and whore to pen about his new bride after the selfish abandonment. And so begins the rocky start to Marilyn's third marriage. Though it could be argued her behavior was just as much to blame as his reaction to it, I suppose. And so the promise of a lovely opportunity had turned just as sour as the face Olivier regularly expressed to his combative co-star. The long trip back to New York City was a quiet one for the new couple, reflecting on their broken-down working honeymoon. Shortly after finally touching back down in New York City, Arthur Miller takes his pipe and typewriter from an extended stay at the infamous Chelsea Hotel, which apparently was slightly more hospitable than when Sid and Nancy had their hellish residency there 22 years later. Word is the place really went downhill. He moves his writer's den to a 13th floor, 57th Street apartment with Marilyn Monroe. Finding in the new Midtown East apartment the largest and most permanent home she's ever known, she has the very bittersweet memories that came along with the baby grand piano her mother had bought her all those years ago, hauled up the stairs with her other important belongings that felt like home. And indeed it is becoming so, because the stork had made an appearance with the housewarming get-together, and the Monroe Millers were to become 3 with a baby on the way. Because nothing heals a rocky relationship like bringing a brand new life into it, right? There were new business ventures in the works for the couple too. Because it finally became apparent that the Greens were siphoning money from MMP, and they were soon set adrift. And who but Arthur Miller was named VP of Marilyn Monroe Productions while Marilyn retained the role of president. Because nothing mends broken wedding vows like going into business together, right? But wholeheartedly humbled and determined to make good on her mistakes that had put the Miller marriage in jeopardy, Marilyn dives headlong into intensive psychotherapy and mental health assistance, which in light of her mother's issues and fear of the same, she had typically but inconsistently been involved in for years before. But she seemed to step up the effort with nearly daily visits to her Dr. Chris. And I don't mean to sound flippant about the couple's expectant news or their potentially mutually lucrative business partnership. I also truly would wish Marilyn nothing but the very best in getting in touch with some of the deep-rooted issues that have stood in the way of her happiness her whole life. Because as I illustrated at the top, this was a brief moment in my estimation and evaluation of this whole story I believe to be the most truly content, secure, and hopeful Marilyn may have ever been in light of a bright future for her family. However, incredibly sad and unfortunate for Arthur in our story, and monumentally devastating for Marilyn, she suffered a miscarriage and lost the baby and any sense of hope or joy I'd mentioned with it. And at the risk of leaving us on a dismal low of a cliffhanger, that is where we will need to step away from Marilyn Monroe's epic saga at this time. But friends, there is still a whole lot of story left, so be sure to come back next time because you won't want to miss the rest. My primary source material for today is The Last Days of Marilyn Monroe by Donald H. Wolfe. And while his book did provide the framework here, of course you know all my stories are meant for entertainment only and not to be in any way carved into stone or displayed at a museum. At least for the next 100 years, but after that you do you. Just a couple quick things before I go. One is a brief update about Anna Delvey. Just after I wrapped production on the last episode, there was a rumor floating around that Anna had been released from ICE and was MIA in lieu of appearing for her deportation. At this time, I'd like to confirm that all the other subsequent news I've been able to find points to the fact that this was indeed a rumor and she is still very much cozy within the confines of an ICE detention facility. She also seems to have amassed a core of support staff and personal assistants. And also noteworthy to our update, she vehemently denies the assertion that she landed at Passages Malibu as a result of a drug overdose or attempted suicide. It does beg the question of exactly what she was doing there, but we'll have to save that question for another day. I will say there are a couple other in-person interviews released on other podcasts recently that are just a hoot if you're interested in how Anna presents her story or allows a listener to create it for her. A master of ambiguous leading wordplay. On a more serious, yet somehow oddly related note, if it's possible considering our subject matter, I feel it's really important to say that if you or someone you know is in a dark or hopeless place like we've seen Marilyn throughout this story, I want you to know from personal experience there's much more help out there that's closer than you'd ever believe from where you're at. And sometimes it's just one simple conversation to feel heard and that you're not alone. And sometimes that's all it takes to set the gears in motion to hoist you out of the darkness. And believe me, you'll never regret you did. So if you find that conversation from the National Suicide Prevention Hotline at 800-273-8255, or even if you have a local professional resource nearby, there are so many reasons to just take that step toward that first conversation. And I will give you my very best in solidarity, waving you over from the other side, because like I said, I've been there. And there is always hope. Dear friends, thanks so much as always for listening, and please be sure to return next time as we come back for the unbelievable conclusion of our deep dive into the life and times of Marilyn Monroe. And in the meantime, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see.